So up next, we have a storytelling session pre-recorded by Miss Donna Washington. Brooklyn, we go hard, we go hard.
Hello, my name is Donna Washington, and I am coming to you from Durham, North Carolina. I am very honored to be here to celebrate Juneteenth with you. So let's start at the beginning, which begins at an end. The Civil War ended in April of 1865, but lots of people did not know that. Today, if you want to tell somebody something, you whip your phone out, you make a phone call, you can text, you can email. There's so many ways to tell somebody something. But back in the 1860s, the only way to do it was either person to person or, well, occasionally you could write people letters. In 1860s, most Americans could not read or write. It just wasn't something most people were learning how to do. We were pre-industrial at that point, and school, everyone going to school and learning how to read and write, that was something that happened when we became an industrialized nation, and we needed people to learn how to read and write well enough to work in factories or read signs that say don't touch this, it's dangerous. So most people couldn't even read and write. So yeah, if you wanted someone to know something, you mostly had to tell them in person. So after the Civil War ended in April, over the course of the next few months, troops of Union soldiers would go from place to place and announce that the war was over. And the story goes that in June, on the 19th in 1865, Major General Gordon Granger rode his troops into Galveston Bay, Texas, and read this announcement that basically comes down to, hey, the Civil War is over, the war is over, and you're no longer allowed to enslave people. It is now against the law. So would all the enslaved people just stay in their homes, and tomorrow you start getting money for your work. And all of you people who've been enslaving these people all these years, they're now your employees and you have to pay them. That was basically it. He just announced that that's what was happening. And the story goes that there was jubilation, people screaming and shouting. And though they were told to keep it down, a number of pigs and cows and geese and chickens went missing. Think of it as back wages. And there was barbecuing and just there was a huge feast and a festival because finally they were free. And the story goes that they are the last people in America who found out that they were no longer enslaved. And so for many African American households, for many years, July 4th was not the day of independence. That's not the day African Americans became free. Juneteenth is when African Americans became free. And so Juneteenth is when Freedom Day is celebrated. Now, as a child, my father was in the Army, and we moved from place to place every few years. The only time we celebrated Juneteenth was when we were actually in the country, which we weren't always when I was a kid, and we could go back to Texas because both of my parents are from there, and there's this huge extended family, and we would have Juneteenth celebrations. They would shoot off fireworks, there'd be lots of barbecue, and in my child brain, I thought Juneteenth was just something you celebrated in Texas. I had no idea that people celebrated it anywhere else in the country. I thought it was like a Texas holiday. I didn't learn about Juneteenth when I was in school. I don't know if you did, but I certainly did not learn about it. So what I want to do is I would like to share one of the heroes that helped African Americans survive through the time of enslavement. And it's a character you might recognize. And maybe, I don't know, maybe you won't. I don't know. It's a spider. His name is Anansi, and he's a trickster character. Anansi loves to eat and eat and eat and eat and eat and eat, and he hates to share. Trickster characters, their job is to teach you what you shouldn't do. That's pretty much their job. But their job is also about resiliency. You can survive things. You need to think your way through it or fight your way through it or whatever you have to do, but you can survive. Now, Anansi, because he is a typical trickster, sometimes he gets away with his tricks and sometimes he gets caught in his tricks. Here is a story where he gets away with it. Now, Anansi lived in a village with his friends, and living in that village was Onini. That means he was a serpent. He lived in this village with Onini, and Onini had a great big bean pot. Now, why this is important is because Onini was able to throw these huge parties and make a lot of beans and have people come and eat out of this bean pot. And of course, everyone was so honored to be there, and they always gave him so much attention, and Onini loved it. But he would never let anyone else borrow his bean pot because he didn't want anyone else to get the attention. He was kind of selfish like that. Well, Anansi decided he'd had enough. You shouldn't hoard your riches. You should share them. There is a philosophy of plenty, which basically means there's enough for all of us. And if I have something and you have need of it and I don't share it with you, something happens to you, that's on me. We are our keepers. We belong to each other. So Anansi goes to Onini and he says, Onini, can I borrow your bean pot? And Onini says, no, because he doesn't let anybody borrow it. But Anansi says, please, 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 please. And he says, no. How many of you know someone who's really, really annoying? They just won't leave you alone. They poke at you and poke at you and poke at you. Anansi is like that. And he wasn't about to let the bean pot thing drop. Please, 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 every day, days and days. And finally, Onini says, fine. If it will make you be quiet, I will give it to you, just to borrow. Anansi says, thank you. And so he took Onini's bean pot home and he made a big old pot of beans and he invited everyone and everyone was eating and thank you to Anansi and, blessing him for being so generous. And Onini sat in the corner furious. Before the meal was even done, he went up to Anansi, bring it back tomorrow. And he went home in a huff. Now the next day, Anansi did not bring Onini his bean pot. No. He brought him a little bean pot. Onini says, what is this? This isn't my bean pot. Oh, yes, it is, said Anansi, because your bean pot had a baby. Onini was stunned. He had had that bean pot for years, had never had a baby for him. And he thought to himself, that's impossible. But he decided to keep the little pot. Well, as soon as my bean pot's feeling better, bring her right home. Well, a couple days later, Anansi returned the bean pot. Well, a few months later, Anansi went over to Onini's house again and knocked on the door. Onini was like, Anansi, what do you want? I want to borrow your bean pot. Nope, not this time. No, you did it once. That's fine. I want to borrow it, please. No, please, 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 please. Oh, and he started that thing again, poking. And Onini thought, okay, look, the last time he borrowed it, it had a baby. That was weird. But, so I'll let him borrow it again. What's the worst thing that could happen? So Anansi took the bean pot, filled it with beans, invited everyone. They all came. They ate the beans. Oh, Anansi, you're so great for sharing. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And Onini, of course, sitting in the corner, watching everyone say nice things to Anansi, and he was just furious that they weren't saying nice things to him. It was his bean pot. Finally, he went up to Anansi. Bring it back the next day. Bring it. I expect it tomorrow. Home he went. Well, the next day, Anansi came, and of course, he didn't have Onini's bean pot. Onini said, where's my bean pot? And Anansi said, you're not going to believe this. He held out 2 small bean pots. Oh, Onini says, what is this? Anansi says, your bean pot had twins this time. Twins. Twins. Well, Onini thought that was ridiculous. Bean pots can't have babies, but he kept the bean pots. And a few days later, Anansi returned his pot. Well, a few months passed. Anansi comes to Onini's door and knocks on the door. And as soon as Onini opens, he goes, do you want to borrow my bean pot? Anansi says, whoa, sure, I do. That's why I said, great, no problem. And he gave it to him because he figured the first time it had 1 child. Second time it had twins. This time it might have triplets or quadruplets. Who knew? The sky's the limit. How many bean pots would he get? He was so excited. So Anansi took the bean pot, but there was no celebration. There was no party. And Onini began to wonder if he was going to have one. I mean, he was pretty sure, because otherwise, why would he borrow it? And then one day, while he was sitting at his table in the kitchen, he heard wailing and moaning and mourning. And he thought, what is that? And he looked out the window, and there was a huge funeral procession going by his house. And he thought, oh my goodness. Oh, I wish I had my bean pot, because I could make beans for everyone at the funeral, and they would all honor me for being so generous. But I can't do that, so I'm going to have to join this mourning party. But he didn't know who had died. Still, he went into the back, and as quick as he could, he put on his most formal mourning gowns, and then he got behind the last person in line, and he started wailing and howling louder than anybody, drawing attention to himself that he was there and he was part of the big civic celebration or civic honoring of whoever died. And then they got to the place to lay the person to rest, and Nancy and many of the others got up and talked about generosity and kindness and nurturing, and still Onini had no idea who had died. He was so embarrassed. He thought, I got to figure this out. I got to figure out who did this, who died. I got to figure it out. And what happened? I got to do it. So Onini waited until the service was over and the people were leaving. And then he sidled up to Anansi and grabbed him by the arm and pulled him aside and said, Anansi, I know this is going to sound terrible, but I don't know who died. Who died? I was looking around. Everybody seems to be accounted for. Anansi said, you didn't hear? No, I didn't hear. Who died? Your bean pot died. Onini just looked at Anansi. He said, what? Anansi said, your bean pot died. Didn't you hear all the speeches? Everybody was so moved by how it had given of itself and it given as much as it could. As soon as I brought it home to my house, Onini, I realized it was sick. All of us have been doing our best for it, but I'm sorry, it died. Onini looked right at Anansi and said, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. Bean pots cannot die. Anansi looked right back at him and said, if it can have a baby, it can die. And Anansi kept Onini's bean pot. Now, sometimes Anansi gets caught in his traps. Oh, yes. You see, a long time ago, Anansi, well, he still likes to eat a lot, but he used to be an absolute glutton. He would just shove food in his mouth and eat and eat and eat. He could eat anything, blocks of meat and cassava. Oh, he could just eat it all. And it would just go on down smooth and just keep him nice and plump. He liked to eat so much that whenever there was a feast that somebody was throwing to share the wealth, Anansi would go to the feast and get to the food and eat it all before anybody could get anything. It was very rude. But Anansi is not known for his politeness. It got so bad that people got tired of throwing feasts because it was no use. You would spend all this time creating these beautiful dishes and Anansi would come just eat them all. So Giraffe and Lion got an idea. Giraffe and Lion came together and they said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have a feast on the same day. Anansi will have to pick which feast he goes to. And then the rest of us, whichever feast he doesn't go to, at least we will get to eat. And so Giraffe and Lion thought, okay, that's fair. Let's do it like that. So the next day, both Giraffe and Lion announced that they're going to hold feasts. And Anansi's so excited because there's 2 big meals coming. And then he found out that they were holding them on the same day. Anansi thought, how will I be able to eat at both feasts? And he thought about it. And right before the feast started, he came up with an idea. He called 2 of his many sons. He tied a rope around his waist and gave one rope to one son. Then he tied a rope around his waist and gave the other one to the other son. So there are 2 ropes tied around his waist. He said to his first son, you go to Giraffe's feast. And he said to his second son, you go to Lion's feast. When they bring the food out, pull on the rope. and I will run to that feast and I will eat as much as I can. And then when they start feeding on the other side, pull the other rope. He says to his son, I will run over there and I will eat as much as I can. So I will get to eat lots at both feasts. So Anansi was very excited to come up with this very clever plan. So his sons had their ropes and they hid them right outside the feast so nobody would see them. And then they went inside. Well, wouldn't you know it? Giraffe and lion started serving the food at the same exact time. Anansi's sons ran out of the feasts and grabbed the ropes at the same time and started pulling at the same time. Anansi was equidistant between the feasts, and he felt one pull, then the other, then the one, then the other, and they squeezed him, and they squeezed and 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 squeezed. Well, of course, Anansi never got to either one of the feasts. His sons eventually wanted to make sure they got something to eat. They dropped the rope, they ran inside, they got something to eat. And when they were full, they came to find out why their father had never come. And when they got there, between the feasts, there he was. Those ropes had squeezed his stomach so tight. His sons untied the ropes, but it was too late. He'd been squeezed like that for so long that he could no longer eat whatever he wanted. And that's why to this day, all spiders must drink their meals. Anansi. Now, like I said, you do know who he is, even if you've never encountered him before. Because you see, when the West Africans were brought out of Africa, one of the first places they were taken was to the Caribbean. And when they got there, they weren't allowed to speak their languages, worship their religions, or tell their stories. They wanted to keep Anansi, and they turned him into a woman named Aunt Nancy. So there are Aunt Nancy stories you can find in the Caribbean. It's Anansi the spider. Here in the South, in America, the enslaved Africans weren't allowed to speak their languages or worship their religions or tell their stories. They wanted to keep Anansi. They turned him into a rabbit. He is the foundation of Brer Rabbit. Brer being a shortened form of the word brother. Brer Rabbit jumped all over America as it traveled with the enslaved Africans and got mixed up with Roadrunner, who came in from Europe, and Coyote, who's Native American, and Grandmother Spider, who's also Native American, and the tricksters that came in from Asia, and the tricksters that came up from South America, and they all got mashed together. And somewhere in the 40s, they got turned into Bugs Bunny. So the next time you see Bugs Bunny, you're actually seeing a little piece of Africa, because Anansi is peeking out of Bugs Bunny's eyes. Thank you so much. My name is Donna Washington. I live in Durham, North Carolina, but you can find me at dlwstoryteller.com. Come and visit me online on YouTube, and you can watch some stories if you type Donna Washington Storyteller into the YouTube box. Thank you so very much. I hope you have a wonderful Juneteenth. Bye, everyone.